Welcome to the channel Life of Slaves. Today we're traveling back to 1861, to the shocking case of a black boy who escaped from a sealed coffin, and what happened next left witnesses terrified because no one could explain it. This is a difficult and intense story. So take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your support helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. On the morning of September 14, 1861, a 12-year-old boy named Malik was nailed inside a wooden coffin and buried 6 feet underground in the red clay soil of Louisiana. He was not dead. And what happened in the hours, days, and years that followed would become one of the most quietly devastating stories of survival, resistance, and revenge that the American South ever tried to forget. This is that story. To understand what happened to Malik, you first need to understand the world he was born into. And that world was not kind. The Beaumont plantation sat on 2,400 acres of Louisiana land about 40 miles northwest of New Orleans. It was owned by a man named Cornelius Beaumont, a third-generation plantation owner whose family had built their fortune on the backs of enslaved people since 1791. By 1861, the Beaumont plantation held 187 enslaved men, women, and children. They worked the sugarcane fields from before sunrise until well after dark. They lived in rows of wooden cabins with dirt floors and no windows. They were branded, beaten, sold, and separated from their families at the whim of a man who saw them as nothing more than property. Malik was born on this plantation on March 3, 1849. His mother, a woman named Annie, had been brought to Louisiana from a plantation in Virginia when she was just 16 years old. She never knew what happened to her own mother. She never saw her father again. This was the normal tragedy of enslaved life. Families were torn apart like paper. Love was a risk. Hope was a luxury no one could afford. But Annie loved her son with a fierce and quiet intensity. She named him Malik, a name she had heard whispered by an old man who remembered the languages of his ancestors. The name meant king in Arabic. Though Annie did not know this, she only knew that it sounded strong. She wanted her son to carry something strong inside him, even if the world would try to break him every single day. And the world did try. From the age of 5, Malik worked in the fields alongside the other children. His small hands picked weeds from between the sugarcane stalks. His small feet learned to move quickly when the overseer's horse came near. His small eyes learned to look down, always down, never meeting the gaze of a white man. These were the rules of survival. Break them and you would feel the whip. Break them twice and you might not survive. The overseer at Beaumont Plantation was a man named Thomas Garrett. He was not the owner. He was not wealthy. He was a poor white man from Tennessee who had found the only kind of power available to someone like him, power over black bodies. Garrett was known for his cruelty. He carried a cowhide whip that he had named Mercy, and he used it with no mercy at all. The enslaved people on the plantation feared him more than they feared Cornelius Beaumont himself. Beaumont was cold and distant. Garrett was close and brutal. Malik learned to stay invisible around Thomas Garrett. He learned to move like a shadow. He learned to make himself small. But there was something inside Malik that could not be made small no matter how hard he tried. There was a fire in him. A stubborn burning thing that refused to die. His mother saw it and it terrified her. "You keep your eyes down," she would tell him at night when they were alone in their cabin. "You keep your mouth closed. You don't let them see what's inside you, Malik. You hear me? They'll kill you for it. They'll kill you just for having a thought in your head." Malik heard her, but he did not always obey. When he was 8 years old, he watched Thomas Garrett beat an old man named Solomon nearly to death for moving too slowly in the fields. Solomon was 63 years old. His back was already a map of scars from decades of abuse. He could not move fast anymore. His body was broken. But Garrett beat him anyway, and he did it in front of everyone as a lesson. Malik watched, and something changed in him that day. The fire inside him did not go out. It grew hotter. He began to pay attention to things. He noticed which paths the overseers took at night. He noticed which parts of the fence were weak. He noticed which enslaved people whispered to each other in the dark, trading information about places far away where black people were free. He was too young to act on any of this knowledge. But he collected it like precious stones, hiding it deep inside himself where no one could see. By 1861, Malik was 12 years old. He was tall for his age, strong from years of fieldwork, and quiet in a way that made people uneasy. The other enslaved children avoided him sometimes. They said he was strange. They said he had old eyes. They said he looked at the white folks like he was counting something. They were right. He was counting. He was counting every cruelty, every injustice, every moment of pain. He did not know what he would do with this count, but he kept it anyway. In the spring of that year, everything began to change. Word came to the plantation that war had broken out between the North and the South. The enslaved people heard whispers about it. They heard that the northern states wanted to end slavery. They heard that President Abraham Lincoln was their enemy or their savior, depending on who was talking. The white folks on the plantation spoke of the war with anger and fear. The enslaved people spoke of it with something they had not felt in a long time, hope. But hope was dangerous. And on the Beaumont plantation, dangerous things were punished. In August of 1861, a sickness swept through the slave quarters. It started with fever and chills. Then came the sweating, the weakness, the inability to eat. The white folks called it swamp fever or plantation fever. Today, we would probably recognize it as a severe strain of malaria carried by the mosquitoes that bred in the stagnant water all around the Louisiana lowlands. There was no real treatment. The enslaved people either survived or they did not. Malik's mother, Annie, was one of the first to get sick. For 3 weeks, Malik watched his mother fight for her life. He brought her water from the well. He sat beside her at night, listening to her labored breathing. He begged the other women in the quarters to help, and they did what they could with the limited knowledge and resources they had. They made teas from willow bark and elderflower. They prayed. They held Annie's hand and told her to hold on. But on September 2, 1861, Annie died. Malik was alone. He did not cry when they buried her. He stood at the edge of the small cemetery where the enslaved people were laid to rest, and he watched them lower his mother's body into the ground. His face was like stone. The other people around him wept and sang and called out to God. Malik said nothing. He felt nothing. The fire inside him had gone cold, replaced by something else, something hard and sharp like a blade. Thomas Garrett watched the burial from a distance sitting on his horse. He did not care about the death of one enslaved woman. He cared only that the sickness was spreading and that it was cutting into the plantation's workforce. Every dead slave was money lost. Garrett had already sent word to Cornelius Beaumont, who was away in New Orleans on business, informing him of the situation. After the burial, Malik returned to his cabin alone. He sat in the darkness and did not move for hours. The other people in the quarters left him alone. They understood grief. They had all lived with it their entire lives. But what happened next was not grief. It was survival. 10 days after his mother's death, Malik began to feel the first symptoms of the fever. It started with a headache that would not go away. Then came the chills, even though the September air was still warm and thick. By the 3rd day, he could barely stand. By the 5th day, he was burning up, his skin hot to the touch, his eyes glassy and unfocused. The other enslaved people did what they could for him. A woman named Ruth, who had been a friend of his mother, took care of him as best she could. She gave him water and tried to bring down his fever with wet cloths. She sat beside him and talked to him, even when he was too delirious to respond. On the 7th day of his illness, September 14, 1861, Thomas Garrett came to the slave quarters with a white man Malik had never seen before. The man was Dr. Edward Marsh, a physician from a neighboring plantation who had been called in to assess the extent of the sickness. Dr. Marsh was not a kind man. He was not a skilled man. He was simply a man with a medical degree who was willing to treat enslaved people as long as he was paid for it. His examinations were quick and careless. He did not touch his patients any more than necessary. He did not see them as people. He saw them as livestock. When Dr. Marsh entered the cabin where Malik lay, he did not approach the boy. He stood in the doorway holding a handkerchief over his nose and mouth and looked at Malik from a distance of about 10 feet. "How long has he been like this?" he asked Garrett. "Week or so," Garrett replied. "Fever won't break. He ain't eaten in 3 days." Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. He watched Malik's chest rise and fall with shallow, labored breaths. He saw the sweat soaking the thin mattress beneath the boy's body. He made his diagnosis in less than 30 seconds. "He's done," Dr. Marsh said. "Won't last the night. I'd say you seal him up before sundown. Don't want him spreading it any further." Garrett nodded. "I'll have the box made." And just like that, Malik's fate was decided by 2 white men who never once touched him, never once listened to his heartbeat, never once considered that he might still be alive. Ruth, who had been standing in the corner of the cabin, stepped forward. "Sir, please," she said, her voice trembling. "He's still breathing." "He's still." "Shut your mouth," Garrett said without looking at her. "Get back to work, all of you. I don't want anyone near this cabin until we've dealt with the body." Ruth did not argue. She could not argue. To argue was to die. She looked at Malik one last time, tears streaming down her face, and then she left the cabin with the others. Malik was alone. What happened in the hours that followed has been pieced together from the few accounts that survived, from the testimonies of those who were there that day and lived to tell about it. Some of these accounts were recorded years later by abolitionists and historians. Some were passed down through oral tradition in the black communities of Louisiana. Some were whispered in secret for generations, never written down but never forgotten. Here is what we know. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon on September 14, 1861, 2 enslaved men named Jacob and Peter were ordered to build a coffin. They were skilled carpenters who had built many coffins before. They worked quickly using rough pine boards from the plantation's lumber supply. The coffin was simple and unadorned. It was 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was built for function, not for dignity. At approximately 5 o'clock, Thomas Garrett and 3 other men entered the cabin where Malik lay. They did not check to see if he was still breathing. They did not check his pulse. They simply lifted his limp body from the mattress and carried him outside. Malik was placed inside the coffin while he was still alive. His eyes were closed. His body was burning with fever. He was deep in the grip of delirium, lost somewhere between consciousness and death. But he was not dead. His heart was still beating. His lungs were still drawing air. He was alive. The men nailed the coffin shut with 16 iron nails. They used a hammer and drove each nail deep into the wood, sealing the box completely. There were no air holes. There was no consideration for the possibility that they might be wrong. At approximately 6 o'clock, as the sun began to set over the Louisiana lowlands, the coffin was carried to the burial ground at the edge of the plantation. A grave had already been dug. It was 6 feet deep, the standard depth for plantation burials. The coffin was lowered into the ground using ropes. The men who dug the grave began to shovel dirt on top of it. Ruth watched from a distance. She was not allowed to come closer. None of the enslaved people were allowed to attend the burial. Garrett had forbidden it. He said he did not want them making a fuss over a dead boy. But Ruth watched anyway. She watched until the grave was filled and the men had patted down the earth with the backs of their shovels. She watched until they walked away, leaving nothing behind but a small mound of fresh red dirt. And then she went back to her cabin and wept. What Ruth did not know, what no one on that plantation knew, was that at the exact moment the last shovel of dirt was thrown onto the grave, Malik opened his eyes. He did not know where he was at first. He only knew darkness. Complete, total, suffocating darkness. He could not see anything. He could not hear anything except the sound of his own ragged breathing. He tried to move and his hands hit wood. He tried to sit up and his forehead hit wood. He tried to turn and there was wood on every side. Panic came first. A blind animal panic that made him thrash and scream and claw at the walls around him. He did not understand. He could not understand. The fever had broken at some point, perhaps in the final moments before the coffin was sealed. And now his mind was clear enough to comprehend the horror of his situation. He was in a box. He was underground. He had been buried alive. Malik screamed until his throat was raw. He pounded on the lid of the coffin until his fists were bloody. He kicked and thrashed and begged for someone to hear him. But there was no one. The grave was too deep. The earth was too thick. His screams did not reach the surface. The air began to run out. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell. This is the part that requires us to imagine what it must have been like for a 12-year-old boy to face death in the most terrifying way possible, alone in the dark, with no one coming to save him. But Malik did not give up. As the air grew thin and his body began to weaken, something happened inside him. The fire that had been burning in him since he was a child. The fire that his mother had tried to protect. The fire that he had kept hidden from the white folks who wanted to destroy it. That fire roared to life. He was not going to die in this box. He was not going to let them win. He was not going to become just another nameless grave on a plantation that had already swallowed so many lives. Malik began to work. The coffin had been built quickly. The wood was rough pine, not the strongest material. The nails were iron, but they had been driven in haste. There were weaknesses in the construction. Malik could not see them, but he could feel them. He ran his bloody fingers along the seams of the coffin, searching for any gap, any flaw, any point of vulnerability. He found one near his left shoulder, a place where two boards met imperfectly, leaving a small gap. He could feel air coming through it, just a tiny whisper of air, but it was enough to give him hope. Malik began to dig at the gap with his fingers. The wood was rough and splintered, tearing at his skin. Blood mixed with dirt and sweat. The pain was excruciating, but he did not stop. He could not stop. To stop was to die. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time had no meaning in the darkness. Malik worked until his fingers were numb, until he could no longer feel the wood beneath them, until his hands were nothing but raw, bleeding instruments of survival. And then, finally, the board gave way. A piece of wood, perhaps 6 in long and 4 in wide, broke free from the coffin wall. Dirt began to pour in through the gap. Malik pushed his face toward the opening, gasping for air, filling his lungs with the smell of earth and clay. He was not free yet. He was still 6 foot underground with hundreds of pounds of dirt pressing down on top of him. But the coffin was no longer a sealed tomb. It was now just another obstacle to overcome. What Malik did next would later be called impossible by those who heard the story. But Malik did not know it was impossible. He only knew that he had to keep moving. He began to claw his way upward through the dirt. He pushed the broken boards aside and forced his body into the gap. The earth pressed against him from all sides, trying to crush him, trying to suffocate him. But he kept moving. He dug with his hands, with his elbows, with his knees. He pushed and scraped and fought for every inch. The dirt filled his nose and mouth. He could not breathe. He could not see. He could only dig upward, always upward. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed. His mind began to fade, losing its grip on consciousness. But still, he dug. And then, after what felt like an eternity, his hand broke through the surface. Fresh air, night air. The cool, sweet air of the Louisiana lowlands filled his lungs as he dragged himself out of his own grave. He lay on the ground beside the mound of dirt, gasping and coughing and shaking. His entire body was covered in clay. His hands were destroyed, the skin torn away, the bones visible in places. He was more dead than alive, but he was alive. Malik lay there for a long time, staring up at the stars. The same stars that had looked down on his mother's burial. The same stars that had watched over generations of enslaved people as they suffered and died on this land. He did not know what time it was. He did not know what day it was. He only knew that he had done something that should have been impossible. He had escaped the coffin. He had clawed his way out of his own grave. And now, as he lay there under the silent stars, he understood something with perfect clarity. He understood that his old life was over. The boy who had been Malik, the boy who had kept his eyes down and his mouth closed, the boy who had hidden his fire from the world, that boy was dead. He had died in that coffin. What emerged from the grave was something else entirely. But Malik could not stay where he was. The sun would rise soon, and when it did, someone would see the disturbed grave. Someone would sound the alarm. The dogs would be brought out. The hunt would begin. Malik forced himself to stand. His legs were weak, trembling with exhaustion and the lingering effects of the fever. His hands throbbed with pain so intense that he could barely think. But he stood, and then he began to walk. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that he had to get away from the Beaumont plantation. He had to disappear into the swamps and the forests and the darkness before anyone realized what had happened. He walked north. He had heard whispers about the North, about freedom, about a world where black people were not property. He did not know how far it was. He did not know if he would survive the journey, but he walked anyway, one painful step at a time, leaving behind the grave that had tried to swallow him. The night was his only ally. The darkness that had nearly killed him underground now protected him above it. He moved through the fields and the forests like a ghost, avoiding the roads, staying away from any place where he might be seen. The swamp water was cold against his legs as he waded through it. The branches of the cypress trees reached down toward him like skeletal fingers, but he kept moving. By the time the sun rose on September 15, 1861, Malik was 3 miles from the Beaumont plantation. He was hiding in a thicket of dense undergrowth, his body pressed flat against the ground, his breathing slow and shallow. He could hear the distant sound of dogs barking. They had found the grave. They knew he was gone. The hunt had begun. Malik stayed hidden for the entire day. He did not move, did not eat, did not drink. He simply lay there and listened to the sounds of men and dogs searching for him. At times they came close, so close that he could hear their voices, could hear them cursing and shouting and promising terrible punishments when they found him. But they did not find him. When night fell again, Malik began to move once more. His body was weaker now, pushed far beyond its limits. The wounds on his hands had begun to fester. The fever threatened to return. But he kept walking north, always north. On the third night of his escape, something happened that would change the course of his life forever. Malik had stopped to rest beside a small creek, drinking the muddy water and trying to clean his wounds. He was so focused on his own survival that he did not hear the footsteps approaching until it was too late. A hand clamped over his mouth from behind. A voice whispered in his ear. "Don't make a sound, boy. We're friends." Malik's first instinct was to fight. But he was too weak and the hands holding him were too strong. He went limp, accepting whatever fate was about to come. The hand released his mouth. Malik turned around and saw 2 figures standing behind him in the moonlight. They were black. A man and a woman, both dressed in dark clothing, both watching him with expressions of cautious concern. "Lord have mercy," the woman whispered, staring at Malik's ruined hands. "What happened to you, child?" Malik did not answer. He did not have the words. He simply stood there, swaying on his feet, and waited for whatever came next. The man stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a scar running down the left side of his face. His eyes were kind, but there was something hard beneath the kindness. Something that had seen too much suffering to be soft. "My name is Samuel," the man said quietly. "This is my wife, Clara. We're conductors on the railroad. You understand what that means?" Malik understood. He had heard the whispers about the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses and hidden routes that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. He had never dared to believe that he might find it. They buried me, Malik said. His voice was barely a whisper. They put me in a box and buried me, but I got out. Samuel and Clara exchanged a look. In all their years of helping runaways escape to freedom, they had never heard a story like this. We need to move, Samuel said finally. There's a safe house about 5 miles from here. Can you walk? Malik nodded. He did not know if he could walk 5 more feet, let alone 5 miles, but he would try. He would crawl if he had to. Then let's go, Samuel said. We'll get you somewhere safe and then you can tell us everything. They walked through the night, Samuel and Clara on either side of Malik, supporting him when he stumbled, urging him forward when he faltered. The safe house was a small cabin hidden deep in the bayou, surrounded by water and accessible only by a narrow path that wound through the cypress trees. It belonged to a free black family named the Washingtons who had been part of the Underground Railroad for nearly a decade. When they arrived, Malik collapsed on the floor of the cabin and did not move for 2 days. The Washingtons cared for him during that time. They cleaned and bandaged his hands. They fed him broth and bread. They let him sleep and heal and slowly come back to himself. When he finally woke up fully on the 3rd day, he found Clara sitting beside him, watching him with worried eyes. You were talking in your sleep, she said softly. Calling out for your mama. Malik looked away. The mention of his mother brought a pain that was sharper than anything his body had experienced. She's gone, he said. Clara nodded. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his bandaged ones. A lot of us have lost people, she said. That's the world we live in. But you're still here, child. You came back from the grave itself. That means something. That means you got a purpose. Malik did not respond. But he thought about her words for a long time after she left. Over the following weeks, Malik's body slowly healed. His hands would never be the same, the scars permanent reminders of his escape, but they healed enough for him to use them again. His strength returned. The fever did not come back. But something else was happening to Malik during those weeks, something internal. The fire that had always burned inside him was changing, transforming into something more focused, more deliberate. He began to ask questions. He began to learn. Samuel became his teacher. The older men had been born free in Philadelphia but had come south to help others escape. He knew things that Malik had never imagined. He knew how to read and write. He knew how to navigate by the stars. He knew how to move through hostile territory without being seen. He knew how to fight. You want revenge, Samuel said to Malik one night as they sat outside the cabin watching the stars. I can see it in your eyes. You want to go back to that plantation and make them pay for what they did to you. Malik did not deny it. They buried me alive. They killed my mother. They deserve to die. Samuel nodded slowly. Maybe they do. But if you go back there now, angry and alone, you know what's going to happen. They're going to catch you. They're going to kill you. And then it'll all be for nothing. Then what am I supposed to do? Malik demanded. Just forget. Just pretend it never happened. No, Samuel said. You remember. You carry it with you, but you use it. You turn it into something bigger than just your own pain. You think you're the only one who suffered. Every black man, woman, and child in this country has a story like yours. Maybe not buried alive, but beaten, sold, separated from their families, worked to death. If we all went running off for personal revenge, we'd all be dead. He turned to look at Malik directly. There's a war coming, a real war. And when it comes, there's going to be a chance to do something that matters. To free not just yourself, but thousands of people. Maybe millions. That's the revenge that counts. That's the revenge that lasts. Malik was silent for a long time, staring into the darkness of the bayou. How do I become part of it? He finally asked. Samuel smiled, the scar on his face twisting with the expression. You already are, son. You already are. In the months that followed, Malik became a part of the Underground Railroad. He was too young to be a conductor on his own, but he assisted Samuel and Clara in their work. He learned the routes and the safe houses. He learned the signals and the codes. He learned how to move through the night like a shadow, invisible and silent. He also learned to read and write. Clara taught him using a worn Bible and a few precious books that had been smuggled into the safe house over the years. Malik took to learning with a hunger that surprised everyone, including himself. Words had power. Knowledge had power. He wanted all the power he could get. But even as he learned and grew, Malik never forgot the Beaumont plantation. He never forgot Thomas Garrett and Dr. Edward Marsh. He never forgot the 16 iron nails that had sealed him inside his coffin. He never forgot the feeling of dirt pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He would go back someday. He swore it to himself, alone in the darkness of the safe house. He would go back, and he would make them remember him. The year 1862 brought changes that no one had expected. The war between the North and the South, which had begun the previous year, was intensifying. Battles were being fought across Virginia and Tennessee. The Confederate states were digging in, determined to preserve their way of life, which meant preserving slavery. The Union was pushing back slowly, realizing that this war would not be quick or easy. And in Louisiana, word began to spread about something extraordinary. Federal forces were advancing toward New Orleans. The Union Army was coming south. For enslaved people throughout Louisiana, this news was like a crack of lightning in a dark sky. Freedom was no longer just a distant dream. It was coming closer every day. Malik heard the news and felt something shift inside him. The time for hiding was almost over. The time for action was almost here. In April of 1862, Union naval forces under Admiral David Farragut launched an assault on New Orleans. The battle was fierce but brief. The Confederate defenses crumbled. On April 25, 1862, New Orleans fell to the Union. The largest city in the Confederacy was now in Union hands. And for the enslaved people of Louisiana, everything changed. In the chaos that followed the fall of New Orleans, thousands of enslaved people fled the plantations and made their way toward Union lines. They came in waves, desperate and hopeful, seeking the freedom they had been promised. The Union Army did not know what to do with them at first. These refugees were classified as contraband of war, a dehumanizing term that nevertheless offered them a path to freedom. Malik watched all of this from his hiding place in the bayou. He watched and waited, planning his next move. He was 13 years old now. He had grown taller and stronger in the months since his escape. The scars on his hands had faded to pale lines against his dark skin, but they were still visible, still a reminder of what he had survived. He was no longer the frightened boy who had been buried alive. He was something else now, something harder, something more dangerous. "It's time," he told Samuel one morning in May of 1862. "I'm going to New Orleans." Samuel did not try to stop him. He had known this day would come. He had seen the determination in Malik's eyes, the focused intensity that could not be contained forever. "What are you going to do there?" Samuel asked. "Find the Union Army," Malik said. "Join them. Fight." Samuel nodded slowly. "You're young. Too young, maybe. But I've seen what you can do. I've seen what you've survived. If anyone can make it, it's you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a letter of introduction. It'll help you when you get there. Show it to the right people and they'll know you're one of ours." Malik took the letter and tucked it carefully into his shirt. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Samuel placed his hand on Malik's shoulder. "Don't thank me yet. The hard part is just beginning. But remember what I told you. Make it count. Make it last." Malik nodded. And then he left the safe house for the last time and began the journey toward New Orleans. The journey took him 3 weeks. He traveled mostly at night, following the routes he had learned during his time with the Underground Railroad. He avoided the main roads and the populated areas, moving through swamps and forests like a ghost. When he finally reached the outskirts of New Orleans in early June, he was exhausted but alive. The city was in chaos. Union soldiers patrolled the streets, trying to maintain order in a hostile population. Confederate sympathizers plotted and schemed in secret, waiting for a chance to strike back. And refugees from the plantations poured into the city every day, seeking protection, seeking freedom, seeking a new life. Malik found his way to the Union headquarters and presented Samuel's letter of introduction. The officer who read it, a young captain from Massachusetts named William Shaw, looked at Malik with surprise and skepticism. "You're telling me you escaped from a plantation after being buried alive?" Captain Shaw asked. "Yes, sir," Malik said. His voice was calm and steady. He had told this story many times now, and it no longer held the power to shake him. Captain Shaw studied him for a long moment. He saw the scars on Malik's hands. He saw the old eyes in the young face. He saw something that could not be faked. "The Army doesn't officially accept Negro soldiers," Captain Shaw said finally. "Not yet. But things are changing. There are people who believe that might happen soon." "I can wait," Malik said. "I'll do whatever work you need until then. But when the time comes, I want to fight." Captain Shaw nodded slowly. "I believe you will, son. I believe you will." And so Malik became a part of the Union effort in New Orleans. He worked as a laborer at first, helping to build fortifications and move supplies. He worked alongside other refugees from the plantations, men and women who had their own stories of survival and escape. They recognized something in Malik, something fierce and unbroken, and they respected him for it. Word of his escape from the Coffin spread through the refugee community. Some people did not believe it at first. It seemed too incredible, too impossible. But Malik showed them his hands. He showed them the scars, and slowly the story became legend. They began to call him the boy who came back from the grave. They said he had been touched by something, blessed or cursed, given a power that ordinary people did not have. They said he could not be killed. They said he would be the one to lead them to freedom. Malik did not encourage these stories, but he did not deny them either. He understood the power of a legend. He understood that sometimes hope needed something to believe in. And he had plans for that power. Plans that reached all the way back to Louisiana, to a plantation called Beaumont, to a man named Thomas Garrett who thought he had buried a boy in the ground forever. The day of reckoning was coming. Malik just had to be patient enough to wait for it. The summer of 1862 was one of the hottest on record in Louisiana. The air hung thick and heavy over New Orleans, carrying with it the smell of the river, the swamps, and the slow decay of the old Confederate order. Union soldiers sweated through their wool uniforms. Refugees from the plantations crowded into makeshift camps, waiting for news, waiting for change, waiting for the world to become something new. Malik waited with them. But his waiting was different. His waiting had a purpose. In July of that year, something happened that changed everything. General Benjamin Butler, the Union commander in New Orleans, made a decision that sent shock waves through the entire South. He began accepting black men into the Union military forces. Not as soldiers, not yet, but as laborers and support personnel attached to the Army. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. Malik was among the first to volunteer. He was assigned to a labor battalion that worked on fortifications along the Mississippi River. The work was brutal, backbreaking, endless. They dug trenches and built walls under the scorching Louisiana sun. They hauled timber and stones and sandbags until their muscles screamed. They worked alongside white soldiers who sometimes looked at them with contempt, sometimes with curiosity, and occasionally with something like respect. Malik did not complain. He did not slow down. He worked harder than anyone else in his battalion, pushing his body to its limits and beyond. The other men noticed. The officers noticed. Word began to spread about the young men with the scarred hands who never seemed to tire, who never seemed to break. Captain William Shaw, the officer who had first interviewed Malik, took a special interest in him. Shaw was an abolitionist from a family of abolitionists. His father had helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society in Boston. His mother had sheltered runaway slaves in their home. For Shaw, the war was not just about preserving the Union. It was about ending the great evil of slavery once and for all. Basic training was conducted at a camp outside New Orleans. For 6 weeks, Malik learned the skills of a soldier. He learned to march in formation. He learned to load and fire a rifle. He learned to use a bayonet. He learned the discipline and the order that would be required to survive in battle. He also learned to read military maps and understand tactical formations. He learned the chain of command and the protocols of military communication. He absorbed everything with the same hunger that had driven him to learn reading and writing. But the most important thing Malik learned during those weeks was not taught by any officer or drill sergeant. He learned it from the other men in his regiment. These were men who had survived the same horrors he had survived. Men who had been whipped and branded and sold. Men who had watched their families torn apart. Men who had lived their entire lives under the crushing weight of slavery. And now, for the first time, they had weapons in their hands. They had uniforms on their backs. They had a chance to fight back. The rage that burned in Malik burned in all of them. But it was a controlled rage, a focused rage. They understood that their performance in battle would determine whether black soldiers would be taken seriously in this war. They understood that they were fighting not just for themselves but for every enslaved person still in chains. The weight of that responsibility shaped them, hardened them, made them into something formidable. The 1st Louisiana Native Guard saw its first real combat in May of 1863 at the Siege of Port Hudson. This was a Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, heavily fortified and stubbornly defended. The Union needed to capture it to gain complete control of the river and split the Confederacy in two. On May 27, 1863, the 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards were ordered to assault the Confederate fortifications. It was a near impossible mission. The rebel defenses were strong, the terrain was difficult, and the black soldiers would be attacking uphill against entrenched positions. Malik was there that day. He was part of a company commanded by a white officer named Captain André Caillou, who was himself a free black man from New Orleans. Caillou was known for his bravery and his eloquence. He had sworn to his men that he would lead them to victory or die trying. The assault began at dawn. The Union artillery opened fire on the Confederate positions, sending shells screaming through the air. Then the order came to advance, and the men of the 1st Louisiana Native Guard began their charge. Malik ran forward with his rifle in his hands, his heart pounding, his lungs burning. The ground beneath his feet was torn and muddy from the artillery bombardment. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Ahead of him, the Confederate fortifications loomed like a wall of earth and timber, bristling with rifles and cannons. The rebels opened fire. Men began to fall around Malik. He saw soldiers he had trained with, men he had come to know and respect, cut down by the withering fire. But he did not stop. He could not stop. To stop was to die. Captain Caillou was at the front of the charge, waving his sword and shouting encouragement to his men. Malik saw him take a bullet in the arm but keep going. He saw him take another bullet in the chest and still keep going. He saw him finally fall, his body crumpling to the ground just yards from the Confederate lines. The assault failed. The Union forces were driven back with heavy casualties. But the black soldiers had proven something that day. They had proven that they could fight. They had proven that they were willing to die for their freedom. They had proven that they were soldiers. Malik survived the assault at Port Hudson. He had a bullet graze across his left shoulder and shrapnel wounds in his leg, but he survived. As he lay in the field hospital that night, listening to the moans of the wounded and the dying, he thought about Captain Caillou and all the other men who had fallen. They had died fighting. They had died as free men with weapons in their hands and courage in their hearts. That was more than most enslaved people ever got. That was something. Malik recovered from his wounds and returned to his regiment. Over the months that followed, he participated in several more engagements along the Mississippi River. He fought at Milliken's Bend in June of 1863, another brutal battle where black soldiers proved their worth against determined Confederate opposition. He fought in smaller skirmishes and raids throughout Louisiana, helping to disrupt Confederate supply lines and liberate enslaved people from plantations. With each battle, Malik grew more skilled, more confident, more dangerous. He was promoted to corporal in the fall of 1863, one of the youngest non-commissioned officers in his regiment. His superiors recognized his intelligence and his leadership abilities. His fellow soldiers respected him, not just for his combat skills, but for the legend that surrounded him. The story of his escape from the Coffin had spread throughout the black regiments of Louisiana. Men who had never met him knew his name and his story. He had become a symbol of something larger than himself. But Malik had not forgotten his personal mission. He had not forgotten the Beaumont plantation. He had not forgotten Thomas Garrett. Every night before he fell asleep, he would run his fingers over the scars on his hands and remember. Remember the darkness of the coffin. Remember the weight of the earth pressing down on him. Remember the faces of the men who had sealed him inside and walked away. The time was coming. He could feel it. In the spring of 1864, Union forces in Louisiana began a major offensive into the interior of the state. The goal was to push the Confederates out of the region entirely and establish Union control over the valuable sugar-producing parishes. This campaign would take the army through territory that Malik knew well, territory that included the Beaumont plantation. When Malik learned of the planned offensive, he went to Captain Shaw, who had been promoted to major and now served on the divisional staff. "Sir," Malik said, "I need to be part of the force that moves through the Lafourche region. That's where Beaumont plantation is. That's where I came from." Shaw looked at him with understanding. "I know. I've been thinking about this. There's going to be a special detachment assigned to liberate the plantations in that area, free the enslaved people, and secure any resources that might be useful to the Union. I want you to be part of it." Malik nodded, his jaw tight. "Thank you, sir." "But Malik," Shaw continued, his voice serious, "I need you to understand something. This is a military operation, not a personal vendetta. We're going there to free people, not to settle scores. Whatever happened to you on that plantation, whatever you're feeling, you need to keep it under control. You understand?" "I understand, sir." Shaw studied him for a moment. "Do you?" "Because I've seen men lose themselves to revenge. I've seen good soldiers become monsters because they couldn't let go of their anger. I don't want that to happen to you." Malik met his gaze steadily. "It won't, sir. I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm doing it. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice." Shaw was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. I believe you. The detachment leaves in 2 weeks. Be ready." Malik was ready. He had been ready for 3 years. The detachment that set out for the Lafourche region in April of 1864 consisted of about 200 men, a mix of white soldiers from Massachusetts and black soldiers from the Louisiana Native Guards. They were commanded by a colonel named James Harrison, a career military officer who had little patience for sentiment but great respect for efficiency. Their mission was straightforward. They were to move through the region, liberate the enslaved population, seize Confederate property, and eliminate any rebel resistance they encountered. They were also to gather intelligence about Confederate troop movements and report back to divisional headquarters. For Malik, the mission was something more. It was the culmination of everything he had survived, everything he had learned, everything he had become. It was the moment he had been waiting for since he clawed his way out of his own grave. The first plantations they encountered surrendered without resistance. The owners had fled, leaving behind only the enslaved people and a handful of elderly overseers. The soldiers moved through these properties quickly, informing the enslaved people that they were free, giving them the choice to follow the army or stay and work the land for themselves. Most chose to follow. They gathered their few possessions, collected their children, and joined the growing column of refugees that trailed behind the military detachment. Their faces were a mixture of fear and hope, disbelief and joy. Some of them wept, some of them laughed, some of them simply walked in silence, as if afraid that speaking would break the spell and return them to bondage. Malik watched them and remembered. He remembered what it felt like to be trapped, to be hopeless, to believe that freedom was an impossible dream. He remembered his mother and the fierce, quiet love she had given him. He remembered the promise he had made to himself in the darkness of the coffin. He was keeping that promise now. Every person they liberated was a victory. Every chain they broke was a blow against the system that had tried to destroy him. On the 5th day of the campaign, they reached the outskirts of the Beaumont plantation. Malik recognized the land immediately, the sugarcane fields stretching toward the horizon, the row of cypress trees along the western boundary, the distant gleam of the big house on the hill. Everything was exactly as he remembered it. And yet everything was different. He was different. Colonel Harrison called for a halt and sent scouts ahead to assess the situation. They returned an hour later with their report. The plantation was occupied by a small Confederate force, perhaps 30 men, mostly local militia. The owner, Cornelius Beaumont, had died the previous year of natural causes. His son, Edmund Beaumont, was away fighting with the Confederate Army. The property was being managed by the overseer, Thomas Garrett. When Malik heard that name, his hands clenched into fists. The scars on his palms seemed to burn. "We'll attack at dawn," Colonel Harrison announced. "Standard approach, artillery first to soften their positions, then infantry assault. I want this wrapped up quickly." Malik stepped forward. "Sir, permission to speak." Harrison looked at him with surprise. Corporals did not usually address colonels directly. "What is it?" "Sir, I know this plantation. I grew up here. I know the layout, the buildings, the terrain. I know where they'll likely position their defenses. Let me lead a flanking party through the swamps to the east. We can hit them from behind while they're focused on the main assault. It'll be over faster and with fewer casualties." Harrison considered this for a moment. "You're from this plantation?" "Yes, sir. I escaped from here in 1861. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "You're the one they buried alive?" "Yes, sir." A murmur went through the assembled soldiers. Many of them had heard the story, but few had realized that Malik's plantation was their objective. Harrison was silent for a long moment, weighing the tactical value of Malik's proposal against the risk of sending a man with a personal stake into a leadership role. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Corporal. Take 12 men and approach from the east. Wait for the artillery barrage, then hit them from behind. But I want prisoners, not corpses. We are soldiers, not executioners." "Understood." "Understood, sir." Malik chose his men carefully. Soldiers he knew, soldiers he trusted, soldiers who understood what was at stake. They moved out that evening, circling wide around the plantation, using the swamps and forests as cover. Malik led them through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths 1,000 times before in another life when he was still a slave. They reached their position just before dawn, hidden in a thicket of oak trees about 200 yards from the rear of the Confederate defensive line. From here, Malik could see the slave quarters where he had grown up. He could see the small cemetery at the edge of the property where his mother was buried, where he had been buried. The grave was still there. He could just make out the shape of it in the pre-dawn light. The earth had settled over the years, but the mound was still visible. Malik stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked away and focused on the task at hand. The artillery barrage began at first light. Union cannons opened fire on the Confederate positions, sending shells screaming across the fields. The rebels scrambled to their defenses, returning fire with rifles and a single small cannon. The noise was deafening, the air thick with smoke and flying debris. Malik waited. He watched the Confederate defenders through the chaos, noting their positions, their movements, their weaknesses. He saw Thomas Garrett emerge from the big house and begin shouting orders to his men. The overseer was older now, his hair gray, his face lined. But he moved with the same brutal energy that Malik remembered. The same men who had ordered his burial. The same men who had watched him be nailed into a coffin without checking if he was alive. Malik felt the rage surge through him, hot and fierce. But he controlled it. He channeled it. He used it. Now, he said quietly. Move. The flanking party burst from the tree line and charged toward the Confederate rear. The rebels, focused on the main assault from the front, were caught completely off guard. Malik's men hit them hard and fast, firing as they ran, overwhelming the confused defenders with sheer ferocity. The fight was brief but intense. Confederate soldiers fell or surrendered as the Union forces closed in from both directions. Within 20 minutes, it was over. The Beaumont plantation was in Union hands. Malik walked through the aftermath of the battle, stepping over bodies and debris. He was looking for one person, only one. He found Thomas Garrett hiding in the smokehouse behind the big house. The overseer had a pistol in his hand, but when he saw Malik approaching with 6 soldiers at his back, he dropped it and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," Garrett said, his voice trembling. "I'm unarmed. I surrender." Malik stopped a few feet away from him. He looked at the men who had caused him so much suffering. The men who had buried him alive. The men who had haunted his nightmares for 3 years. Garrett looked back at him, and for a moment there was no recognition in his eyes. Just the fear of a defeated man facing enemy soldiers. Then something shifted. Garrett's eyes widened. His face went pale. "No," he whispered. "It can't be. You're dead. I watched them bury you." Malik said nothing. He simply stood there, letting Garrett see him, letting the reality sink in. "You were dead," Garrett repeated, his voice rising with hysteria. "The doctor said you were dead. We put you in the ground. We put you in the ground." "You buried me alive," Malik said quietly. His voice was calm, steady, controlled. "You didn't check if I was breathing. You didn't check my pulse. You just nailed the coffin shut and threw dirt on top of me." Garrett was shaking now. "It wasn't my fault. The doctor said you were dead. I was just following orders. You were the overseer. You gave the orders. You watched them dig the grave. You watched them lower the coffin. You could have stopped it at any time, but you didn't because I was just another slave to you, another piece of property. You didn't care if I was alive or dead. Please," Garrett begged. "Please don't kill me. I'll do anything. I'll tell you anything you want to know. Just please don't kill me." Malik looked at him for a long moment. He thought about everything this man had done. Not just to him, but to everyone on this plantation, the beatings, the whippings, the families torn apart, the lives destroyed. He thought about his mother working herself to death under this man's brutal supervision. He thought about all the others who had suffered and died because of Thomas Garrett. The rage was there, burning in his chest. The desire for revenge was overwhelming. He could kill this man right now, and no one would stop him. No one would blame him. This man deserved to die. But then Malik remembered something. He remembered the words that Samuel had spoken to him in the bayou all those years ago. If we all went running off for personal revenge, we'd all be dead. That's the revenge that counts. That's the revenge that lasts. He remembered what Major Shaw had said before the mission. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. Malik looked at Thomas Garrett, trembling and begging on his knees, and he made a decision. "I'm not going to kill you," he said. Garrett's face flooded with relief. "Thank you. Thank you. I knew you were. I'm going to do something worse," Malik continued. "I'm going to let you live. I'm going to let you live long enough to see everything you believed in destroyed. I'm going to let you watch as every slave on this plantation walks away free. I'm going to let you watch as the world you built crumbles to dust. And then I'm going to let the Union Army put you on trial for your crimes against these people." He turned to the soldiers behind him. "Take him into custody. He's to be held for military tribunal." The soldiers dragged Garrett to his feet and hauled him away. The overseer was screaming now, cursing and threatening and pleading. But his words had no power anymore. He was nothing now, just another defeated rebel, waiting for judgment. Malik watched him go. Then he turned and walked toward the slave quarters. The enslaved people of Beaumont Plantation had gathered in the open space between their cabins. There were over 100 of them, men and women and children, watching the Union soldiers with a mixture of hope and fear. They had heard the gunfire. They had seen the battle. They did not yet understand what it meant. Malik walked into the center of the gathering. He looked at the faces around him, searching for ones he recognized. There was Ruth, the woman who had cared for him during his fever, now older and grayer, but still alive. There was Jacob, one of the carpenters who had built his coffin. His face creased with shock as he recognized the boy he had helped to bury. There were others, faces from his childhood, people who had known his mother, people who had watched him grow up. "My name is Malik," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Some of you remember me. Some of you thought I was dead. I was born here. My mother, Annie, is buried over there in that cemetery. 3 years ago, they buried me there, too. But I didn't die. I got out. I found the Union Army. I became a soldier. And now, I've come back." He paused, letting his words sink in. The war is turning. The Confederacy is losing. And by order of the President of the United States, all enslaved people in the rebel states are now free. That means you, all of you. You don't belong to anyone anymore. You belong to yourselves. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then someone began to weep. Then someone else. Then the weeping turned to shouts of joy, and the shouts turned to singing, and suddenly the air was filled with voices raised in celebration. Malik stood in the middle of it all, letting the sound wash over him. This was what he had been fighting for. This was what mattered. Not revenge, not death. Liberation. Freedom. Justice. Ruth pushed through the crowd and stood before him. Tears were streaming down her face. "I prayed for you," she said. "Every night after they buried you, I prayed. I prayed that somehow, someway, you were still alive. I never stopped believing." Malik reached out and took her hands in his. "Your prayers were answered, Ruth. I'm here. And we're all free now." Over the following hours, the Union soldiers secured the plantation and began the process of transitioning it from a slave labor camp to a liberated territory. The enslaved people were given the choice to stay and work the land as free laborers or to follow the army to New Orleans where they could find employment and start new lives. Most chose to leave. They gathered their belongings, collected their children, and joined the column of refugees heading south. They walked away from the only home most of them had ever known, leaving behind the fields that had consumed their labor, the cabins that had confined them, the graves of their loved ones. Before he left, Malik visited his mother's grave one last time. He stood there in the fading light of the afternoon, looking at the small wooden marker that bore no name, just a cross carved by someone who had cared enough to remember. "I did it, Mama," he said quietly. "I kept the fire burning just like you always wanted. I didn't let them break me. And now I've come back and set everyone free." He knelt down and placed his hand on the earth, feeling the cool soil beneath his scarred palm. "I wish you could have seen it. I wish you could have walked out of here with me. But I know you're watching somehow. I know you're proud." He stayed there for a long time, alone with his memories and his grief. Then he stood up, wiped his eyes, and walked away. There was still work to do. There was still a war to win. The campaign through the Lafourche region continued for several more weeks. Malik and his detachment liberated 7 more plantations, freeing over 1,000 enslaved people. With each liberation, Malik's legend grew. Stories spread about the soldier who had escaped from his own grave, who could not be killed, who brought freedom wherever he went. Some people said he was blessed by God. Others said he was protected by the spirits of his ancestors. A few whispered that he had made a deal with darker forces. Malik did not encourage these stories, but he did not deny them either. He understood their value. A legend was a weapon just like a rifle or a cannon. It could inspire allies and terrify enemies. It could give hope to the hopeless and fear to the fearful. And there was still so much work to do. The war continued through 1864 and into 1865. Malik fought in several more engagements, proving himself again and again as a soldier and a leader. He was promoted to sergeant in the fall of 1864, a remarkable achievement for someone who had been a slave just 3 years earlier. In April of 1865, the war finally ended. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, bringing the bloodiest conflict in American history to a close. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was abolished. 4 million people were free. When news of the surrender reached Malik's regiment, the celebration was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Men who had been slaves just a few years earlier threw their hats in the air and embraced each other with tears streaming down their faces. They had done it. They had won. They had proven to the world that they were not property, but human beings capable of fighting and dying for their own liberation. Malik celebrated with them. But even in the midst of the joy, there was a heaviness in his heart. The war was over. But the struggle was not. He knew that the defeat of the Confederacy was just the beginning. There would be resistance. There would be violence. There would be attempts to push black people back into bondage through new laws and new systems of oppression. The work of freedom was never finished. It had to be defended and renewed with every generation. In the months after the war ended, Malik was discharged from the army with honors. He was 17 years old, a decorated veteran with scars on his hands and fire in his heart. He had no family, no home, no clear path forward. But he had something more valuable than any of those things. He had purpose. Malik returned to Louisiana and threw himself into the work of reconstruction. He helped establish schools for the formerly enslaved, teaching them the reading and writing skills that had been forbidden to them under slavery. He worked with the Freedmen's Bureau to secure land and resources for black families trying to build new lives. He organized communities and advocated for their rights in the face of hostile white resistance. He also kept track of what happened to Thomas Garrett. The former overseer had been tried by a military tribunal in 1864 and convicted of crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at a federal prison in New York. It was not the death sentence that some had demanded, but it was justice of a kind. Garrett would spend the next decade breaking rocks and digging ditches, experiencing for himself a fraction of the suffering he had inflicted on others. Malik received word of the conviction with grim satisfaction. He had told Garrett that living would be worse than dying. He had been right. But Malik did not dwell on revenge. He was too busy building something new. In 1868, Malik married a woman named Sarah, a former slave from Mississippi who had escaped to New Orleans during the war. Together, they had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Malik named his daughter Annie after his mother. He told her stories about her grandmother, about her courage and her love, about the fire that had been passed down through generations. The years that followed were not easy. The promise of Reconstruction gave way to the betrayal of redemption as white Southerners reclaimed political power and began systematically stripping away the rights that black people had won. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and disenfranchisement. The dream of true freedom seemed to recede further and further into the distance. But Malik never stopped fighting. He never stopped believing that the fire he carried inside him would eventually consume the injustice that surrounded him. He lived to see his children grow up strong and proud. He lived to see his grandchildren born into a world that was still deeply unfair but no longer enslaved. He lived to tell his story to anyone who would listen, so that future generations would know what had been sacrificed and what had been won. Malik died on March 3, 1919, exactly 70 years after his birth on the Beaumont plantation. He was surrounded by his family, 3 generations of free people who owed their existence to a 12-year-old boy who had refused to die in a coffin. His last words, according to his granddaughter, were, "Keep the fire burning." And they did. His descendants carried his story forward through the decades, through the civil rights movement, through the long struggle for equality that continues to this day. They named their children after him. They told his story to their grandchildren. They kept his memory alive, a reminder of what one person could accomplish with courage, determination, and an unquenchable fire in their soul. The Beaumont plantation no longer exists. The big house burned down in 1873 under circumstances that were never fully explained. The slave quarters rotted away and returned to the earth. The sugarcane fields were eventually sold off to other landowners. Today, there is nothing left to mark the place where so much suffering occurred, where so many lives were broken and destroyed. But in the small cemetery at the edge of the old property, 2 graves remain. One belongs to Annie, Malik's mother, who died of fever in 1861. The other belongs to no one, because the person who was buried there did not stay buried. The coffin is still down there, 6 foot underground, broken open from the inside. The marks of fingernails are still visible on the wood, preserved by the clay soil of Louisiana. Scientists who have examined the site say it should have been impossible for anyone to escape from that coffin, especially a 12-year-old boy weakened by fever and dehydration. But Malik did it anyway. He did the impossible. And in doing so, he proved something that oppressors throughout history have always tried to deny, that the human spirit cannot be contained, cannot be crushed, cannot be buried. That no matter how deep the grave, no matter how tight the chains, there will always be someone who finds a way to break free. This is the lesson of Malik's life. Not revenge, though he had every right to seek it. Not hatred, though he had every reason to feel it. But something stronger than both of those things. Something that cannot be nailed into a box or covered with dirt or erased from history. Hope. Resistance. The unquenchable fire of freedom. When they buried Malik in 1861, they thought they were disposing of a problem. They thought they were getting rid of one more troublesome slave. They did not realize that they were creating something far more dangerous than any living person could be. They were creating a legend, a symbol, a story that would outlast all of them. The boy who came back from the grave. The soldier who liberated the place of his enslavement. The man who chose justice over vengeance and spent his entire life fighting for the freedom of others. That is who Malik was. That is what he became. And that is why his story matters, even now, more than 160 years after a 12-year-old boy opened his eyes in the darkness of a sealed coffin and refused to die. Some fires cannot be extinguished. Some people cannot be buried.